Well, thank you guys so much for allowing me to be here. As you can see, I'm the board chair for Tennessee, so I actually live in Nashville, but was actually raised just over the hill in Pleasanton, and I spent most of my childhood there. I actually went to school in San Diego, so I am a California girl at heart. As you can tell, I don't have any draw, and I promise not to say y'all. So we should have a good time here today, but I do want to just take an opportunity to just talk a little bit about kind of how I got here and also about my role at the Alzheimer's Association. And then if you oblige me, I will share a little bit about my TED Talk and walk you guys through the TED experience, which was amazing, and then also have an opportunity to give you a little commentary, the behind the scenes, or as we would call it in Nashville, the writer's round, to hear the inspiration behind the songs. So, but first of all, I just want to say that it's very funny. I was actually talking to Claire about Alzheimer's, and in Tennessee, we actually are the number 6 in prevalence of Alzheimer's. And she was sharing the numbers in California, which are a little over 700,000. And in Tennessee, we are almost as much as 700,000, being a significantly smaller state than the state of California. And I think that just has to do with access to healthcare there in Tennessee and just being a very rural state in those elements. So, but anyway, I think what I want to say here about is just a little bit of the statistics. Anybody who is in the caregiving space, in the senior space, is probably very much aware of what is going on with Alzheimer's disease and what is happening in our day-to-day lives with families. I remember a day back early in my career where people didn't really know what Alzheimer's disease was. I always share a statistic of that we used to give more money to dolphin research than we used to Alzheimer's care. And one of the things that has been evolving, which I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing, because so many people are being affected by this disease day in and day out, the awareness of this disease is increasing. You can't walk into a room without talking to somebody who has a family member or a friend or is directly caregiving for somebody who has Alzheimer's disease. And while the awareness is growing, it also kind of breaks my heart that the prevalence of this disease is growing at such a rapid pace. The one thing that's exciting about this time, and I don't know if you guys have heard this, but this whole idea of the error, that what we're saying at the Alzheimer's Association is the error of treatment. And it's for the first time ever, I don't know if you guys know this, for the first time ever, we actually have treatments. The amyloid plaques are being affected in these treatments. I have had the honor to see at the Alzheimer's Association, we have the early dementia, they're the early MCI group. They're an advisory board that goes to DC, they talk to legislators, they're talking to doctors and scientists, and I've had the honor to meet multiple of those people that are actually on these trials, are actually using these drugs, and you are seeing the effects. I actually did an interview for another client with one of them, and he has been on one of the treatments for over 10 years, and you would think you wouldn't even have a clue that person has dementia, and he's been suffering with it for over 10 years. So these treatments are working. Our job now is market access to make sure that these become available to families and to seniors that wouldn't necessarily be able to afford them. So getting the awareness out, getting the funding, supporting your local walks, doing your longest day event. I'm going to do a little Alzheimer's commercial here for a second, and doing all of that. They're not paying me for any of it. Trust me, they're not paying me for any of it. But that is something that we really need to do. So we have the prevalence here of over 700,000 people are suffering with Alzheimer's. And I think the other number that's near and dear to my heart is the 1.3 or almost 1.4 million people that are actually caring for those 700,000, because we know that our healthcare system can't handle both of those. We know the effects of Alzheimer's caregiving. Some of you probably know it personally, and some of you probably know it by the people that you're serving. So also want to say thank you to any of you who are caring for somebody who has Alzheimer's disease or you are working with people with Alzheimer's disease, because as a gerontologist, I know the side of it that as a professional, but then as a daughter. So if you didn't get a chance to see my talk, I've actually lost 2 people. You can see that I'm wearing my purple flower here today. I've lost 2 people to Alzheimer's and dementia, my grandfather, and then 3 years ago, well, actually closer to 4 now, I lost my dad to Alzheimer's. He unfortunately was what I think they call one of those, I think they call them the fractional deaths. He actually, unfortunately, got COVID towards the end of 2020. He got it on a Tuesday, and he was gone on a Thursday. And so we dealt with the effects of what COVID had on caregiving during that time. So it was a very, very, very difficult time. So I'll try not to get emotional. But I would love to share a little bit about my TED journey and also being able to grow and spread awareness around Alzheimer's disease with my TED Talk. So how many of you actually have been a caregiver or are caregiving for somebody with Alzheimer's disease? Oh boy, that was more hands than I was hoping. Well, thank you guys for all your work there. I was the caregiver for my dad and worked also with my mother, who is 82 years old. They are about the same age, so my mother was, of course, struggling with all of those things as well. She very much didn't have any of the cognitive, but she was struggling with some of the physical things around just caregiving for somebody with dementia. And I lost my grandfather many years earlier. And so I'll tell a funny story. So I was getting married. I'm not married anymore. But I was getting married, and my grandfather and my grandmother came into town. They were from Michigan, and they came in for my wedding. And I was at the house, and I went upstairs, and you know how seniors always have that list of medications, and they kind of sit them next to their pills, in the bathroom or in the kitchen. And so my grandpa had this list of medications on this little list. And I look at the list, and I'm a gerontologist, and I've been working in dementia care, and I walk up, and I'm reading the list, and I'm like, Aricept? Why is Grandpa on Aricept? So I walk downstairs, and I turn to my mom, and I'm like, why is Grandpa on Aricept? And my mom, of course, is like, what's Aricept? Well, everybody in this room knows what Aricept is, right? And so donepezil, and then my grandma came in, and she's like, what's Aricept? And I said to them, well, it's actually the most prescribed drug for dementia. And my mom and my grandmother were both like, what? So my grandmother and my grandfather went home to Michigan. My grandmother, of course, made a doctor's appointment immediately and found out that my grandfather had been diagnosed with dementia a year prior. So he had been suffering with dementia for over a year and didn't tell a soul. And I tell that story because one of the things that we have as a big thing to overcome, and that's why awareness is so important, is the stigma related to dementia. And that's one of the things that when I get up on this stage, I'm really hoping to break down, because early detection is so necessary for any of these treatments that we are seeing today. They are for early dementia. They are not for mid, they're not for late. They're for early, and a lot of people are afraid to get that diagnosis because our society doesn't necessarily see a place for people who have dementia as productive citizens. So people are losing jobs, they're losing licenses, they're losing connections with family. There's all of these things that are happening from a diagnosis. So there are a lot of people that are afraid to admit what they may have, and what it is causing is their inability to get treatment and slow down this process. And that is a huge thing that we have to overcome as people who are in this fight, because if we cannot allow people to get diagnosed, we are never going to be able to get them the treatments that they need. We're getting there with some of the things. They say that there's going to be new treatments that are coming out related to the tangles. So that's very exciting. So what I share today is really to focus on that part of it, is let's get the awareness out. And one of the reasons why I shared my story on the TED stage was because I wanted to show a different side of dementia. And so how many of you guys actually had a chance to listen to my talk? Because I'm going to modify my presentation based on if you guys have already heard it. So did I see about half a dozen hands there? Okay, well, thank you so much for the listen. And if you haven't listened to it, still go on YouTube and listen to it, because, then I get more views. But no, just kidding. I'm kidding, and not really kidding, but kind of kidding. Well, if you will oblige me, I will kind of walk you guys through a little bit of my talk. I don't know if you guys know this, but to do a TED Talk, you actually only get 12 minutes, and it's 100% memorized. You do not get a teleprompter. You do not get cue cards. So if you ever see somebody doing a TED Talk and they've got cue cards or they're on Zoom, just so you know, it's not as hard as what you've got to do. So hold on, I'm trying to pull up my notes here. So, but I'll give you guys a little bit of the commentary behind the talk as well. Oh great, I lost my document that was here just months ago. It's bad when you put in your Google Docs the word dementia and like 100 files come up. You know that's not necessarily good. So, but I start out my talk talking about how I'm a gerontologist, and I became a gerontologist at a very young age, and I would do a ton of research. So I talk about at the beginning of my talk, I say, I'm a gerontologist. I walked in with all my research, everything that I know, all the books. I'm still here, the Montessori program. I walked in with my binder and I was ready to go. We were gonna do this dementia care. My parents actually were living here in the Bay Area in Livermore. And my dad's dementia was getting too hard for my mom to manage. And so they ended up moving really close to me in Tennessee when I moved there. And so I got the front row seat of being able to take care of my dad. So I was ready. I had been prepping, and my sister would say, well, Amy's the gerontologist. She should be the one taking care of dad. So they shipped mom and dad into Tennessee, and I talk about at the beginning of my talk about how I was a gerontologist and I was ready. I was so ready. And what I really didn't really take into consideration was all the emotions around actually being the daughter. And it kind of was a little overwhelming to me, and I talk a little bit about that. And, my dad was, a comp controller, and he was a very controlling man, and we didn't have the best relationship. And so when I got thrown into this caregiving seat, there was all of these things that I talk about. So I talk about this story at the beginning of my talk where my dad would call me constantly, and he would call my phone. And, I don't know if any of you else are daughters or have fathers who have very demanding jobs, but in my world, you didn't call dad at work. You never called dad at work. It didn't happen. You didn't do it. You never got through. And then if you did call him at work, you heard about it when you got home. Well, my dad was blowing up my phone 3 and 4 times a day when he was dealing with dementia. And it wasn't like what I say in my talk it wasn't like, oh, hey, Amy, how are you doing? Or what's going on? It was like, somebody stole the remote. You didn't hand me the papers from the budget. I had taken over the finances also, and I'll share that story as well. And all of these things, and I was getting so frustrated. And I say in the talk, I'm like, I hate to admit this because I'm the gerontologist, so I'm supposed to, have my stuff together here. I'm not supposed to be the person that's not able to handle this. And I used to hang up the phone all the time. I just click, oops, sorry. And because I was just like, I can't deal with this right now. I can't do all of this right now. And so I had to admit that I was getting very frustrated. I was in this state of role reversal. And then eventually I stopped hanging up the phone. And then I started asking questions because I was like, well, God damn it, why are you calling me at work? I was never allowed to call you at work. So I was playing this whole game in my head, bringing up way more emotions than I thought I would ever. And I started asking him all these questions. But I knew he couldn't answer those questions. And I was kind of being a brat, which is my nickname in my family, about all of this stuff. And it was really hard for me to be like, okay, Amy, settle down. You need to take a breath. And it was kind of like a reality check for me because as the gerontologist, I was struggling. I was the one who knew this is how this was supposed to go. I was the one who knew the research. I knew all of this stuff, but I was still sitting here. It is warm. It's a little warm. I'm like, oh, am I the only one who's warm? So it was, for me, it was like, oh my goodness, if I'm struggling with all of this, then I can only imagine people who don't even know the resources. I knew the people to call. I knew about the Alzheimer's hotline. I knew all of these things, and I was struggling. And so, as my sister said, Amy's the gerontologist, so she should take care of him. And I also realized, as you probably can tell from my personality, I don't like to take things overly seriously, and I also like to be extremely authentic. And there was a time that happened where my dad thought I was his sister Wendy. And I say in my talk, to get a laugh, I say she's 5'2", blonde, and 70 years old. So, when he was, this was many years ago, so it's kind of like, I was always kind of like, really? Like, we don't look anything alike. And I was struggling with this idea, because he would come, I would walk into the room, and he would literally be like, hi, Wendy, it's so good to see you. When did you get here? And she lives in Baltimore. I'm like, we're literally like, there's no popping by Aunt Wendy. And so I would really struggle because, in most dementia care, they say, therapeutic fibbing, meet them where they are. Come, just pretend like you're Aunt Wendy. And I really struggled with that as a caregiver, because it's like, well, where does this go? And if I'm constantly in this state of therapeutic fibbing, am I actually connecting with my dad? How am I doing that? And I'm a terrible liar. So it's like, I was struggling, and I'm like, this doesn't feel right. I'm lying to my dad, and then, later he's gonna be like, well, where'd Aunt Wendy go? And I'll be like, oh, I don't know. And I just really struggled with that whole idea. And so I really spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, so how we're going to have these moments, and we'll redirect and we'll do those things, but how do I actually connect with my dad? Like, how do I actually create opportunities where we can have conversations? Because when you've got somebody who has dementia, what do you end up always talking about? Dementia. Like, that's all you got in common is I'm caring for you with dementia and you have dementia. And you can't talk about anything else because you have dementia. And we go into this circle and we're not connecting, and then we're all sitting there going, I wonder why our relationships decline. Well, if you're talking about dementia all the time, who wants to talk about dementia all the time? If I don't want to talk about dementia all the time, then then most people won't. So I was trying to work through, how do we actually connect? And so I really spent some time. We did all the Montessori. If I showed you pictures and stuff like that in my talk, I have a couple pictures that I show, but you can see my dad. He's got like the little whiteboard calendar, and today is blah, blah, blah. He's got balloons to do balloon volleyball in the background. Like, we hooked him up. Like, he had full on, he had baskets of socks, he had all kinds of stuff. But I realized we weren't really having conversations. And I was trying to figure out, how do we have conversations and how do we create purpose in his life? And so one of the first things that we did, so my mom used to make a list. So my dad was like, the to-do list, like the handyman of the house. Like, so my mom, every week, she would have a list of things that my dad would do, changing light bulbs, whatever it may be. And so we actually ended up, because he would just follow my mom around like a puppy. My mom was like, oh my gosh, can we just have him go do something? Because he needed somebody to manage him 24 hours a day. And so but he didn't need caregiving. He didn't need bathing. He didn't need dressing. He didn't need any of that. And so I had an idea where I said, well, why don't we get him a handyman? And so we had a gentleman named Mitchell that came into my parents' house every week. And he was literally, he was a delightful man and the kindest soul you will ever meet. And he let my dad follow him around, and they would go through my mom's list, and both of them would work together. Some weeks, my dad did absolutely nothing. He couldn't do anything. Other weeks, maybe he held a light bulb for Mitchell. But my dad felt like we're crossing the things off of this. He felt like he was contributing back to my mom. He felt like he was actually doing something, that he wasn't just a burden. And it really changed how they started interacting. And so, is that me? So that was one of the things that I really loved. The next thing that we did was I worked with him on the finances. So my dad was, as I mentioned, a very controlling man. He did all the finances for the family. And when I took them over, it was quite the feat, because I'm the baby. I'm the youngest. I'm supposedly the screw up. And so my dad was like, what? We're gonna give this all to Amy? And so that was a big challenge. And so my dad and I would have budget meetings. And there were spreadsheets that I created that he constantly lost. And I remember one time because my dad also called the family work. He thought we were his employees because my dad was a high functioning boss and he worked a lot. So my mom used to get very upset because he would refer to us as his staff or his employees. And so one time my dad and I got in a really big fight over the finances, and he called me the worst CFO that he had ever hired. And I think that was one of my low moments. I think I threw the papers at him and said, well, the pay sucks. And I left. And so we, went through those battles. And I also talk about in some of my other talks of because I feel like sometimes when you're talking to somebody who's a professional in caregiving and they're like, well, be patient and do all of that. And sometimes I say to them, I'm like, you can only be patient for so long. And I think sometimes we get guilted into feeling like if we kind of mess up as caregivers every once in a while, that we're terrible people and that we don't love our family members. But I will give permission to every person who is in here. You can have your moments. You can have, because to be perfectly honest, in most situations, when you're caring for somebody, especially a parent, that's probably, and by the way, if you have a productive relationship with your parents, God love you, but most of us probably don't. And then you throw on family caregiving on top of that. So give yourself some grace around that. I will give you permission if you need it to give some grace to yourself and know that some days you're gonna just throw papers at people or hang up the phone. And it's gonna happen. And I'm a gerontologist and I did it more times than I'd like to admit. And so just give yourself grace. The other thing that I did was, because my dad was an entrepreneur and an operations guy, we decided to start what I coined Dryer Ball Inc. And I was trying to figure out an activity that would help with his dexterity, because my dad actually had Lewy bodies dementia, and so he dealt with all of the Parkinson's related elements of it. If you're not familiar with Lewy bodies, it's quite a challenge. You deal with a lot of hallucinations and gait, and the Parkinson's related pieces are very challenging. So I was trying to figure out a way to get him to help with that dexterity, to keep his hands moving. And so I don't even know how I came up with this. I think it was the trend of dryer balls. Everybody was obsessed with dryer balls. Does everybody know what dryer balls are, by the way? Okay, they're those wool balls that you put in your dryer so you don't have to use those chemical dryer sheets. So my dad would sit, and I actually shared in my talk a picture of him actually rolling the dryer balls. And he would sit there for hours on end, and he would roll dryer balls. My mom would put them in the washer, and she would get them all set, and I was in charge of sales and marketing. And so I would go out and sell them. So I would come over and we would talk about it and we would go through it, and he would always say that sorry, some of these stories just make me laugh. He would talk to me about he's not seeing enough revenue, and so he thinks that I'm not selling enough. Well, my dad is not producing huge volumes, let's just be perfectly honest. He's probably getting one a week done, if that. They're kind of a little cattywampus, so my mom is over here complaining that they're actually not washable, and I'm like, okay, you guys, you're overthinking this. This is not. And so we would have fun, but the thing that I noticed about it was that my dad and I started talking about Dryer Ball Inc. We didn't talk about dementia. We talked about Dryer Ball Inc. And it was a lot of fun because we would have conversations, and it was amazing the amount of stuff that he retained about Dryer Ball Inc. There was a bunch of stuff that he wasn't retaining, which no problem. But there was some stuff that he was enjoying and actually really he got excited about it. And we did get to a place where it kind of got a little bit more challenging for him to manage. So we only had Dryer Ball Inc. for about 6 to 7 months. But I have very fond memories of working on Dryer Ball Inc. And this is the part that I get a little teary. But I will say, all of these things that we did, in that, one of the things I noticed about my dad was he kind of forgot a little bit who the man he was. And our relationship really started to evolve. And he became a man that hugged and said, "I love you," which my dad never did. And so what I got to experience through all of this was a different person. And I like to think that he kind of forgot who that person was, that he was pretending to be, or that guard. He forgot that he had that guard up all the time. And then when we started really creating genuine connection, our relationship really started to change. And the dad that I had during dementia times, and I say this in my talk, was a different dad. And actually probably a better dad than what I had when I was younger. And so I share my talk and I share these stories because I think a lot of people look at people with dementia and then they see the relationship that they had, and good, bad, or indifferent, right? And then they are trying to hold on to what it was. And what I just say to people, and even when you're talking to families, is put your baggage aside and try to find a new place that you can go. And maybe it's a new relationship. Maybe it's a new experience. And rather than trying to hold to the way it always was, create an opportunity that may be completely different and not look anything like the way it was. And in my case, might actually be better. So that's what I always tell people. It's not going to be the same. It's going to evolve. And by the way, it's not going to be easy and it's going to be frustrating. But the sooner you actually decide that we're going to start anew, I think everybody ends up for the better. At least that was my experience. So I tell people all the time, I'm like, you know, you maybe not getting a handyman, you may not be starting, your own Dryer Ball Inc., but, maybe you're writing a cookbook or taking photos or dancing. I told a story when somebody was talking to me earlier. There was a woman who talked about how her and her mom would just brush each other's hair, and they would just brush each other's hair, and that was like their thing. And they would just gab and sit there and brush each other's hair. My dad was bald, we weren't brushing any hair. But those are things that you have to figure out, what does it look like for you? What are things that you could do that align? Maybe it's getting out some music, to things that those people love. Maybe there's crocheting. It's not gonna be perfect, and it's an ebb and flow of a day. Some days we talked about Dryer Ball Inc., and some days we didn't. So that's what the inspiration of my talk was about. I hope you take a listen. It's only 12 minutes, but that gives you a little bit of the stories behind what I was sharing there, and the opportunity that I was trying to give people with thinking about this and creating, as I called it, new conversations around dementia. So anyway, thank you so much.
Does anyone want to ask Amy any questions? We're opening the floor to any questions.
Huh?
What if you're not as fortunate to have somebody who's pleasant and you have somebody who's angry and accusing everybody of stealing things?
Yes.
Stuff like that.
I think I will tell you that I dealt with that with my dad as well. I'm sorry, if I gave you the impression that my dad was pleasant in any way, shape, or form, I did not do my job very fully here. But I will say, I think there are challenges when you're dealing with some of the later stages of dementia. I think at some point, the reality, I will say one of the blessings in my story is my dad, while he was in late stage dementia, he was not at a situation where he had such behaviors and, where I really did not want the staring at the wall blank look for him. So I was fortunate for that. I think the one thing that I will say is if you can start to create something else to concentrate on, what I will say is what I noticed when we started doing these different things and he felt like he was starting to have some purpose, some of those behaviors did go down because I think people are just trying to grasp some level of control over their lives, and I think that's where a lot of those behaviors come from. And so what I noticed, and I will tell you, I'm giving you snapshots in times. There were days where Dad stayed in the TV room and we all decided to have our separate days, right? So what I noticed, especially with the handyman stuff, is some of his behaviors of feeling like he wasn't contributing or there wasn't stuff going on. And my dad had severe hallucinations as well. Like, I'll tell a very off-color story, but my dad had, my mom was always the pit of a lot of jokes in our family, but my dad he always used to see this witch that would come by, the witch, and he would get this he would go white. And so we would always know that kind of the witch was here. And my dad and I have a very similar sense of humor. And so one day he goes, and he was very, very shaken. And he goes, the witch. And I go, oh, Dad, don't worry. That's just Mom. And it broke, my dad and I had used humor a lot for things. And I think the thing for you is you've got to find, I don't know the person that you're talking, you've got to find those little nuggets of that person that is, as they always say, they're still there, and try to find the ways to bring out that part of them versus what you're dealing with now. Because the behaviors are just a response to the disease, right? And so, I would brainstorm with the people that know them best, like what were the things that gave joy? What were the things that they focused on? What are things that'll bring them back to who they were before and give them that sense of purpose? I would find those things and create some environment where you can have autonomy and do them, and then see if that slowly, it's not going to be easy, but if you can start to integrate those in their lives so they're not as concentrated on all that other stuff, maybe it would help and create some purpose. So, but I apologize that you're dealing with all of that. Yeah. Anything? Hi. Is that Dan?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Tell me more about therapeutic fibbing.
So therapeutic fibbing is the clinical term for if somebody with dementia is kind of telling a story, or they're in a situation where it's not the reality, but this is what they think the reality is. It's in theory said that you are supposed to just meet them at that place and kind of go along with it. And you're not going to necessarily disagree. You're not necessarily going to say, well, no, that's wrong, or, oh, actually, no, that's not Wendy, that's Amy. You're not going to do any of that kind of stuff. You're not going to directly call out. You're going to kind of, so they call it therapeutic fibbing because in theory you're not correcting them. You're not necessarily allowing them to come into our reality. We're meeting them in their reality, which I do think has, especially if you're in a situation where you're dealing with a behavior, trying to tell them that they're wrong and, oh, that's not going to get you anywhere. So I do think it has a place, but I think also where I struggled with it was when you're really trying to actually create new connections, it doesn't really get you there. So while you may need to use it to manage behaviors, and a lot of it's used in, a lot of settings where you're caring for somebody, you're not necessarily trying to build, a father-daughter relationship, right? So where you're in spurts of moments, I think therapeutic fibbing is very appropriate, but for a long term, what I said in the talk was like, but for 24/7, it gets very hard for the caregiver. I think it wears on the caregiver, I think, to try to constantly and be like, wait, hold on, you're living in this alternative reality. So does that make sense? Yes.
This is mother-in-law.
Yeah.
We've had her head examined. And
Yeah.
they said nothing, basically. But
Oh,
it's
wow.
clear that she's in early stages.
Yeah.
Mother had it. And when
So
you
she's
go
not
there,
showing any of the tangles or the amyloid plaques or any of that kind of stuff?
nothing clinically that
Yeah.
they've found
Mm.
to this point, but anyone that spends
Yeah.
a fair amount of time with her
Mm.
can tell you that she's hallucinating. She's
Mm.
talking about people that have come to the house, that sat in the living room and had this meeting, but never talked to her.
Mm.
And then, but everyone was very nice.
Mm.
And you're saying, well, no one was here.
Yeah.
You know, this is your house and all these kinds of things. So I struggle a little bit with pushing back on, there's no one outside and
Yeah.
Bush is doing a documentary on you. That's not happening.
Yeah, I think with those, I would lean in a little bit more to understand what they're actually seeing, maybe in that situation. Like my dad had 3 people that watched him sleep every night,
Mhm.
and so he always felt like he couldn't sleep because they were always watching him. And just lean into what that's making them feel, you know, who that is. You know, my dad slowly started to actually identify who those people were. And so I would lean in there versus maybe, because to them, they are there.
Yeah,
So maybe you just can't see them.
you definitely cannot.
Karen.
You mentioned a drug that one of your clients had used for 10 years that really reduced the symptoms. What is that now?
So there are 2, I don't know if you want to talk about the treatments, but there are, we're at 3 right now with FDA approval. So we can share, I'm going to probably butcher the names, but I don't know if you want to give the one that just got approved, but
Yeah.
do you want to, go ahead.
Sure.
She's the staff expert, so we'll
So-
let her give out the names of the drugs.
There are 3 new medications in a class of medication called a monoclonal antibody. These are infusions that are used in the earliest stage of people with the biology of Alzheimer's. So they're not for people with other dementia. They have to have that diagnosis of the amyloid plaque, that buildup of amyloid plaque, and these treatments are shown in clinical studies to remove that amyloid, which seems to be one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. I think the trick to these are early intervention, really understanding those warning signs early enough, and then being able to, as Amy mentioned, having health equity where you're actually in an area where you could actually get them.
Mhm.
Now, being here in the Bay Area, we're very lucky. We have access to Sutter and UCSF and Stanford, all of which are giving these infusions. 3 have been approved by the FDA. 1 will be discontinued as of November. So as of November, we'll have 2, which is Leqembi or lecanemab, and the newest one called Kinsula,
Mhm.
which is donanemab. And what's interesting about donanemab, which differs from Leqembi, is participants in the clinical trial were given a predetermined level of that amyloid clearing. And after 12 or 18 months, they no longer needed the infusions. So when we think about cost and side effects, that is encouraging. So.
And does everybody know that the key differentiator of Alzheimer's disease versus Lewy body's dementia or any other is the amyloid plaques? Has everybody heard that before? And then the other thing is the tangles, which is the other piece of dementia. So they're 2 different areas. And I think overall what they're saying out there, and I don't want to steal your thunder here, but they're saying that they believe that the cure for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias will be kind of very similar to what we're doing for cancer. You know, we've got a cocktail of things that we're looking to do. So, but all very exciting things. So we are first time in the history of this disease actually have treatments. Everything prior to this has been symptom management, managing anxiety, managing behaviors, all of those types of things, not actually treating the cause. So, yeah, Karen.
One other practical kind of thing. What if you early to mid stages and you're struggling with them taking medication? So
Mhm.
you get the medication dispenser that's got the timer and
Yes,
they sleep through it.
right.
Or they ignore it.
Mhm.
Or they
Is this person living independently right now? Yeah.
pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big challenge. I think that's where you're in a situation where you need to have somebody come in or actually be handing them the medications at that point, so.
Or prohibits that.
Yeah, I know. It's, yeah. It's such I wish I had solutions, yeah.
And
it's-
there's nothing other than facilities, right?
Well, there definitely are aides that can come in and just come in during med time, and the team here probably could share those types of things where you can just have somebody come in to do meds. You know, you do the morning meds and they come in and do the afternoons. And they come in and they do that. So adult day programs, I don't know, are also a good option. They can also help that. And you don't need somebody you don't need a nurse to do that if they're just handing them the meds, yeah. So, yeah. Is there a good day program? Do you guys have day programs here? Adult day? Avenidas, yeah. Ah, there we go.
Grosvenor House.
Yeah. And those are fairly affordable. We did it for my dad for many. It was 30, like, I don't know what your guys are here too. I'm going to show my Tennessee here, but they were $25 a day. So,
That's so
yeah, not here. Yeah, I kind of figured I was not going to throw that price out. Anyway,
I have a question.
come on over. Yeah.
Question regarding the medication. Is it accessible for everyone at this point?
Mm.
I would say no. I
No.
think the short answer to that is no. I
Yeah.
think, and certainly donanemab, which was just approved by the FDA a couple of weeks ago, these systems need to get ready to be able to deliver these infusions. I think Leqembi is accessible, but I think, there's still the instance of information and really being able to get into the hands of people in the earliest point of intervention, which is really key with these clinical findings, right? Is that early detection is a very important piece of that. And oftentimes, we're not diagnosing, like you said, if at all, with your grandfather,
Right.
where the medication was given before anybody knew. Until something happens, that probably means they're no longer eligible. So it does create an opportunity for us as family members and patient advocates, as well as those of us in the healthcare field, to think about the importance of health equity, access to diagnosis, and really destigmatizing the disease.
Well, one thing that I've heard is, and I don't know if this is as prevalent here, but the scan that's required is actually one of the things that they've been working on from a market access perspective, is because there is a certain diagnosis that they need to do in order to properly administer the infusion and the medication. And so there's a scan. And so one of the issues that we've had in Tennessee is that there's not enough hospitals and places that professionals that actually have these scanning equipment. So while we may be able to get the drug, we actually can't get the diagnosis equipment to actually be able to effectively administer the drugs. So that's also a piece of the puzzle that you don't necessarily always think about. You're like, oh, well, you can get the drug. And the drug is also very expensive right now. So I think it's about $30,000. Isn't that the number, right? Yeah.
And it's not covered yet.
No.
It is covered.
It's covered by the
It's
FDA,
covered.
yes.
But it's covered by CMS,
Yes.
yes. And there are new insurance companies every day who are covering it. Yeah, maybe not at 100%, but probably
Not great.
80%.
Yeah. We're getting there. We're
Yeah.
getting there. It's not perfect.
What kind of
we're-
scan are you talking about?
So there is I don't, yeah,
So
you're
not a
gonna,
CT scan or an MRI scan,
It's-
it's something else?
it's, yes, please, thank you.
It's a PET scan, a positron emission tomography test.
Uh-huh.
And I think we are lucky
Yeah.
here in the Bay.
Yeah.
You can get access to a PET scan. But we work in all of Northern California, and if you were in Humboldt County or Modoc County, for those Californians that know where those two counties are, anybody know where those two are? The top right and left-hand counties. You're not getting a PET scan up there. So while we're very fortunate here in the Bay Area, other parts of California have the same access issues you
Yes.
see.
Yeah. Yes, hi.
Yeah, on a comment to that, what about the blood work though? Isn't that the initial test, the blood work?
Can it be determined?
The blood work is more predictive, yeah.
Yeah,
it's a-
so we're not using a blood test yet for diagnosis.
Mhm.
That's in clinical trial.
Oh.
And we're not able to use a blood test yet to show, that amyloid. Not for, these types of trials. There are trials that are using blood tests to diagnose, but not yet FDA approved. But close, keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks, we've got a
And-
big conference coming up.
And if you're also, I'm gonna also do an Alzheimer's commercial here for a second. If you're interested in all of this stuff and you want to help raise awareness, there is something at the Alzheimer's Association called an awareness ambassador that you can actually take a training for and actually go out and speak around this kind of stuff. And there's also presentations. Go to alz.org because there's also a lot of seminars and things that you can go in on Zoom that share a lot of this information. They go through the facts and the figures and they talk about the things that are going out. There's actually a summit that's going on, as we are actually next week, that is going to be bringing all the leading scientists and doctors around Alzheimer's research. So next week and probably the weeks that follow, there will probably be some new information coming out because there's always some new things that come out of this conference that's happening in Philadelphia. And so, if you are interested in the science, there are a lot of opportunities to learn more and around the drugs and how they work and what is actually Alzheimer's and how you can actually raise awareness for it. So, yeah.
So is there information on the Alzheimer's Association site about these two meds?
There is.
Yeah.
Under.
Yes.
And if you just go to alz.org, there's a whole treatment page that gives you sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, on where to go to learn, and get the facts.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for having me.
Thank you.